Now, before we dig deeper, I again want to show this pre-rendering of multiple instances of this page in action. And for this, again, we can run this npm run build command here to build this for production. So npm run build. And what this will do is it will create an optimized production build again, pre-rendering all the pages it needs to pre-render. And we see what it did here again. We see that it pre-rendered a couple of pages. It generated 5 pages in the end here. We see that for the starting page, for /nothing, so for this index.js file, it recognized this 10 seconds revalidation period. And we see that for this dynamic page here, it generated 3 instances for P1, P2, P3, which makes a lot of sense because these are the parent values I'm returning here in getStaticPaths. It also pre-generated the 404 page just as it did before already. Now we can also see this if we dive into the next folder again, into server pages. Here we see the HTML files for those different parameters. We also see the JSON files for preloading that data if we would navigate to such a page through a link. So after we already are on the page, not for the initial page load. And if we have a look at those HTML files, in there, of course, ultimately somewhere we will see our product one text. Here it is. So we see that here as well. Now I can also show you that pre-fetching of data though, because in index.js we do render some links. So now if I do run npm start here, if I do that to start that production server on our local machine with that build project, if I reload, we got these clickable links. And if you now open the developer tools here and go to the network tab, if I now reload localhost 3000, you'll see something interesting. You see here are requests to P1 JSON, P2 JSON, and P3 JSON. And if you click on them, you see what was fetched. And in the end here, it pre-fetched the props for the page that would need to be loaded if you click on one of these links. So in the end here, it pre-fetched that data, even before I hovered over the links, just because I'm on this page. Now, the exact point of time when data is pre-fetched, that's something figured out and done by Next.js. The important part for us here is that it does that pre-fetching for us. Now, when we now click on a link, we're not sending a new request to the server and load the pre-rendered HTML file. Instead, we stay in this single page application now. We stay here in this React application, which was loaded and hydrated after this initial request. So in the end, now JavaScript will render a new page for us, just as it would do in a regular React app without Next.js. But the data needed for this page is coming from that pre-fetched JSON file, which it loaded and read under the hood on our behalf, so that it doesn't need to fetch the data after we navigated to that page, but so that the data is already there when we do navigate, to show this final product one page even faster. And that's another neat feature built into Next.js, which we get for free, so to say. Now let's again explore this fallback key here in greater detail. So what's up with this fallback key here? The fallback key can help you if you have a lot of pages that would need to be pre-generated. Here I only have 3 dummy products, and I'm currently not even fetching that data from that file. We'll do that later. But we only have 3 products. Now imagine that you have like an Amazon-like website with millions of products. Of course, pre-generating all those products like this might not be optimal. Not just because I hard-coded this here. We could fetch this dynamically from this file, so that's not the problem. But simply because pre-generating all those millions of pages might take super long. And there might be products, let's say you're not Amazon, which are rarely visited. If you're building a blog and you have hundreds of articles, You might have some articles which are basically never read. So then pre-generating such rarely visited pages is a waste of time and resources. That's where fallback becomes important. Here, we can set this to true, and then, for example, we could decide to only pre-render some pages. So let's say we want to pre-render the page with product ID 1, so with P1, because that's a highly frequented page, it's visited very often, but we don't want to pre-generate the other two pages. With fallback set to true, that's possible. Because now if I save this, you will notice that if I go back to the starting page, if I click on product 3, we still load this page successfully, even though it was not added here to paths. And the reason for that is that with fallback true, we tell Next.js that even pages which are not listed here, so even parameter values for the PID parameter which are not listed here, can be valid values that should be loaded when they are visited. But they're not pre-generated, instead they're generated just in time when a request reaches the server. And that allows us to pre-generate highly visited pages and postpone the generation to less frequented pages to the server, so that they are only pre-generated when they're needed. So that can be a very useful behavior. But you'll notice a problem here. If I don't click on a link here, but instead I directly enter this in the URL and therefore send a new request to this page, we actually get an error. Cannot read property title of undefined. The reason for that is that this pre-generation, this dynamic pre-generation when it's needed, does not finish instantly. So therefore, instead, when using this fallback feature, you should be prepared to return a fallback state in your component. For example, by simply checking if loaded product is maybe not a thing with if not, and then returning something like loading here. And if you do this and you add this to your component function and you save everything, if you now reload this page, you see loading briefly, and then Next.js will automatically give you that data once it's done loading. So this is a little bit like the standard React solution with useEffect and setState, except for that you don't need to do any of that. You just get something through props, you check if it's there yet, and if it's not, you show that fallback content. And once it's there, Next.js will automatically update this component page for you and then return the regular content here. So with that, you see that now I can also reload this page and we still load this successfully eventually because of that fallback feature. An alternative would be that you don't set fallback to true or false, but to a string with a value of blocking. If you do that, then you don't even need that fallback check here in the component, and hence we can comment this out, because then Next.js will actually wait for this page to fully be pre-generated on the server before it serves that. So then it will take a little bit longer for the visitor of the page to get a response, but the response which is sent back will be finished. So if I now reload, that still works, it just takes a bit longer. And again, it's up to you which approach you need for your application. Sometimes it's important to show something quickly, especially if you know that generating the page and fetching the data might take a bit longer. Sometimes it's worth to wait for it and you don't want to show an incomplete page to your visitors. In such a case, blocking can be better. Here you saw both, and as you see, both is super easy to use. So now we learned about getStaticPaths. At the moment, the way we use it is still a bit unrealistic though, because I hard-coded my PID values here into this function, and in reality, we would be fetching this kind of information from a database or a file as well. So therefore, in reality, we would basically just repeat this code here, and hence I'll grab that code and just outsource it into a separate function. async function called getData, where I then return data. And since it's async, we can use await in there. And then we can just get our data here by calling getData and awaiting this here in getStaticProps. And we can do the same in getStaticPaths. So a little bit of refactoring to have no code duplication. With that, we get the data. And now here in getStaticPaths, we want to use the data to read all the IDs we want to support. So for this, we could get our IDs array here by going through all the data pieces. Now the data we get back here, by the way, will already be parsed JSON since we do that in getData. So it will be a JavaScript object. So here IDs then should be an array. And in dummy backend, we have this products array. So in the end, what we want to do is we want to access data.products and then just map this array of complete product objects into an array of just product IDs. Just like this, for example. Just extracting the ID for every product and then having such an IDs array here. And then we need to translate this IDs array into an array of such objects. So here we could then create another object, params, which is another array. But we create this array by going through the IDs and mapping these IDs such that every ID is mapped into an object. And we need to wrap this in extra brackets here, extra parentheses, so that this is not considered as the function body, but that we instead inline return a new object for every ID, an object with a params key, which then holds another object with a PID key, which has this ID as a value. And that's then repeated for every ID. So we end up with an array full of such objects which have exactly that structure we need down there so that we can set paths equal to params here. Or we name this paths with params maybe. Whoops, paths with params, just like this. And of course, we could perform these two operations in one single step as well. I'm just using two steps here to hopefully make this a bit easier to understand. And with that, if I now save this, it still works as before. Everything still works as before. Now also all the pages are pre-generated again, by the way, because I am going through all the products here. So now we can also set fallback to false again because we are loading all possible IDs anyways. And that's of course a bit more realistic here because typically you would not pre-hard code all supported values here. Typically you don't know all dynamic values in advance as a developer, but instead you would fetch them from the same data source as the actual data is then fetched from later. So now that we understand this concept of having a fallback and of generating certain pages for certain IDs, let's take another look at the not found case that we're trying to request a page which doesn't exist. And let's start by simply visiting a page with a product ID of P4. Now we get a 404 error page here, so a not found page. Because in our data, we only have the IDs P1, P2, and P3. There is no product with an ID of P4. Now we get this not found error because in getStaticPaths, we load and build our array of IDs, our array of routes or of parameters for which pages should be generated from that dummy backend JSON file. So paths with params here in the end is an array where we only configure param pairs, so PID value pairs, for the values P1, P2, P3, since these are the only IDs that exist in that dummy backend JSON file. And automatically, if we then try to load this page for an ID which was not pre-generated, we do get this 404 error. Now that makes sense. What if we use fallback true though? What if we, for example, assume that the products stored in dummy backend.json might not be all the products for which we are able to fetch data? So we only generate pages for the free product IDs we find in that file, because we go through that file here in getStaticPaths. But by setting fallback to true, we then also tell Next.js that even if an ID value is not found here, we still might be able to render a page. That's what the idea behind fallback is, that we don't have to predefine all possible pages, all possible values for the dynamic segment. So therefore, now if I set fallback to true here, we will see that if I visit P4, I get this error that we cannot read the property title of undefined. Now we saw that before in the course already. We get this because we need to have this fallback scenario here that we're still waiting for a product. Because when we set fallback to true and not to blocking, then Next.js will instantly return a page which does not yet have the data, and it will load the data in the background and give it to us on the page and re-render the page once the data is there. So we need to render this fallback for the time we're waiting for the product to load. But if I now do that and I reload, we see loading here, but then after a while we get another error, failed to load static props. And this hopefully also makes sense. I'm trying to load this product page for an ID of P4, for which we just don't have any data. Because in getStaticProps, we are also reaching out to dummy backend.json, and we're trying to find our product by ID in that file. And we won't find a product with ID P4 in that file. So we see loading initially as a fallback, but then Next.js tries to load the actual data for this page, and it just fails there because we don't have such a product. So that's why we get this error eventually here then, because it failed to load the actual data. Now that is a perfect example for setting the not found property on the object we return in getStaticProps. Here, when we try to get our product, we also want to check if we don't have a product. And if we don't have a product, so if we failed to find a product for the given ID, then we want to return an object where not found is set to true. By setting this, we are able to use fallback true and try to find a product for a parameter value which was not predefined here, because maybe we do have that. Maybe dummy backend.json is a more dynamic data source which could yield that product. But if we then still fail to fetch it, we don't want to return the regular page with the missing data, which causes an error, but we then want to show the not found, the 404 error page instead. So with that, if we save this, now you see for P4, I get loading and then the 404 page. And for P3, on the other hand, it still works as before. So that's how we can then utilize the not found property here in getStaticProps together with fallback true. And of course, it's up to you which combination makes the most sense for your exact scenario and use case. This is just one example and one other idea of using Next.js and its features. So now we had a look at getStaticProps and getStaticPaths. And these two are working together. You don't always need both. In the case of index.js, we only needed getStaticProps. But for dynamic pages that should be pre-generated, you do need both. Now you might recall that earlier in this module, at the beginning of this course section, I showed you this slide and I referred to two forms of pre-rendering: static generation and server-side rendering. Now, what we had a look at thus far, that's static generation, because we statically pre-generate pages. Even though it's not fully static because of incremental static generation, which I also explained, but generally pages are pre-generated. And that is really important. Inside of getStaticProps and also inside of getStaticPaths, we don't have access to the actual request which is incoming, because these functions are not called for the actual request, at least not only. With incremental static generation, they are also called for incoming requests, at least sometimes if they need to be revalidated, but they are generally called when your project is built. So inside of getStaticProps, you don't have access to the actual incoming request. Now, very often, you also don't need access. For example, here, in the examples I showed you thus far, we don't need access to the actual request which is reaching the server. But sometimes static generation is not enough, and instead you need real server-side rendering. Which means that you do need to pre-render a page for every incoming request. So not at most every second, but really for every incoming request, and or you need access to the concrete request object that is reaching the server, because, for example, you need to extract cookies. And that is something we're also going to see later in the course when we talk about authentication, but I already want to introduce you to real server-side rendering here. The idea is simple. Next.js also supports this run real server-side code use case, which means it gives you a function which you can add to your page component files, which is then really executed whenever a request for this page reaches the server. So that's then not pre-generated in advance during build time or every couple of seconds, but it's really code that runs on the server only, so only after you deployed it, and which is then re-executed for every incoming request. And that code is added to a function called getServerSideProps. Just like getStaticProps, it's an async function, it needs to be called exactly like this, and it needs to be exported. And you can only add it to your page component files. But then if you do have such a function in a page component file, Next.js will execute that function, and it will execute it whenever a request for this page is made. And therefore, you should only use either getStaticProps, what we saw thus far, or getServerSideProps, because they kind of clash. They fulfill the same purpose, they get props for the component so that Next.js is then able to render that component, but they run at different points of time. So let's say we have a dummy user profile JS file here in the pages folder. So a user profile page, for which I'll add a component here, the user profile page component. And in here, we want to get some user-specific data and show that on the screen. So of course, we export it like this, but now that's a page which we can't pre-render, because we need to know for which user we are rendering this. Now we could expect a user ID as part of the URL, so we could make this kind of dynamic and expect the user ID instead. But then everyone who enters this ID in the browser is able to see some data for that given user ID. So that's not what I want here. Instead, we want to identify the user making the request, let's say with help of a cookie which we set before. Now at the moment we don't have that here. We didn't add any authentication, we're not placing any cookies on the user's machine, and therefore we don't really have the use case here. But it hopefully is a scenario that's easy to imagine. And later in the course, we'll dive into authentication and we'll then have this actual scenario. So therefore here we want to return some user-specific data, let's say the username, but again we need to get access to the request object which carries the cookies and the headers to find out which user sent this request. That would be a typical use case for get server-side props. We can't pre-render this page because we don't know which users will have in advance, and we don't get access to their cookies in advance. Therefore, we want to export an async function here, an async function called get server-side props. Now we get a context object here, at which we'll take a closer look in a second, and we also need to return an object here, and the object which we return actually needs to have the same format as it does in getStaticProps. So that return object does not change. It should have a props key, it can have a not found key, and it can have a redirect key. The only difference is the revalidate key. That is not required here, and that can't be set here because get server-side props per definition runs for every incoming request. So there's no need to revalidate after a certain amount of seconds because it will always run again. So therefore we return an object with props, which makes sense, I guess, since it's called get server-side props. And these props will then be made available to this function, which will still be called by Next.js. But as mentioned before, it will not be called in advance when we build the project, but really for every incoming request. So here we could then have a username prop, which I for the moment hardcode to max. And then here we output props.username in the component function. And if we do all of that, and we then visit a /user profile page, so this page which we just added, we see max here at the moment. So that works, and that proves that get server-side props works because that's where the value max is coming from. But the important thing now really is that this only executes on the server after deployment, and also on our development server here, but it's not statically pre-generated. And that has a couple of important implications. So which implications does get server-side props running on the server only have for us? The implications can be found in this context object. Unlike context in getStaticProps, we don't just have access to the params and a couple of other less important fields. Instead, we get access to the full request object as well. And also to the response which will be sent back, so that we could even manipulate this and add extra headers if we wanted to. To be precise, we do get a couple of values, a couple of keys in this context object, and we do get access still to the params. That does not change. If we have this on a dynamic page, which we don't have here, but if this would be on a dynamic page, we still would get access to params. But in addition, as mentioned, we also get access to the request object and the response object. Now, if you know a bit of Node.js and especially of Express.js, this might look familiar to you. There you also can write server-side code where you get a request object and a response object. And you can then manipulate the response object as needed to send back an appropriate response. Now you don't need to worry about sending back a response here. Next.js will do that for you. It will be the rendered component. But you can manipulate the response before it's sent back by adding extra headers, for example. By adding a cookie, for example. In addition, you can also dive into the request object that reached the server, and you can read incoming data from there. For example, headers that were attached to the request, and therefore cookie data that was attached to the request. Request and response, the objects you're getting here are the official Node.js default incoming message and response objects. So here I will briefly log the request and then also log the response so that we can get a closer look at them. If I save this, and I reload user profile. Now this code executed again, and now we see a long log here because these are quite complex objects with a lot of built-in methods and properties. So you see there's a lot in there, and you definitely don't need to go through all of that. But for example, you see that there are headers in there, which we could extract if we wanted to. Now we don't need this here, but it will become more important later once we talk about authentication. Now I will quit this here and not go through all of that, but you can definitely take a close look at that. And these again are the default node objects for incoming messages and for responses. And I'll link the documentation of these objects to this lecture so that you can take a closer look at what's in them in the official docs as well. And getting access to this kind of data can sometimes be important if you, again, for example, need special header or cookie data. Another reason, as mentioned before, for using get server-side props could be that you don't need request or response specific data, that you don't need to work with request or response, but that you really want to ensure that this function runs for every incoming request, so that it's never statically pre-generated. Because, for example, you have highly dynamic data, which changes multiple times every second, and therefore you know that any old page you would be serving would already be outdated. That could be another reason for using get server-side props. But as you see, using it is simple. You can still write any server-side code in there. You can still reach out to the dummy backend JSON file as we did it before, for example. And you still return the props for the component function in the end. The only key difference is the kind of data you get access to in the context and the timing of this function. Now, get server-side props can sometimes be useful. I also want to mention how you would use it with a dynamic page. Here, before, when we used get static props, we also needed get static paths to let Next.js know which instances of this page should be pre-generated. Now, when using get server-side props, that's not the case. If I do have a UID.js file, UID in square brackets, so that I have a dynamic page for a single user for different user IDs. If we use get server-side props, we don't need and we can't use get static paths. So here, if I have the user ID page, and I get some props here, and here I then simply return h1 tag where I output props ID, something like this, and we then export this. If we do all of that, and I then also have this async get server side props function, which we export. If we have this, then you will see that we don't need get static paths at all. Here I just return an object, and now I'm interested in the concrete param value which I'm getting here. So we can get access to that through context. From there, we can still extract params, as I mentioned. And from params, we can then still get our user ID by accessing UID, since that's the identifier I picked between square brackets. And then in the props, which we pass to the component function, we could have the ID prop, since I'm accessing that here, and set this equal to user ID dash, and then let's say the user ID we extracted from the URL. Just to have some dummy code here that proves that this code actually did execute before this component function code ran. With that, if we want to test this, we first of all need to make sure we get rid of pid.js, because otherwise we have two dynamic segment pages on the same level in our pages folder. So Next.js wouldn't know if a value after / nothing should be a product ID or a user ID. And therefore, if I move the pid file into the products folder here, and in index.js, I update my links to go to /products/someID. Now we resolved this clash, because now we know that if it's just / something unrecognized, it will always target this user ID route. And now with that, if I bring back that development server. If we visit, let's say, /u1 for user 1, we see user ID u1 here. So it worked. And it did work without us adding getStaticPaths. Why? Because this runs on the server only anyways. So Next.js does not pre-generate any pages at all, and therefore, of course, it also doesn't need to know which pages to pre-generate, because there is no pre-generation. So unlike in the other case with getStaticProps, where we do pre-generate pages and where we therefore do need to tell Next.js for which parent values pages should be pre-generated, with getServer-side-props, that's simply not an issue because we run that server-side code for every request anyways. So there is no pre-generation and therefore no need to define those dynamic paths in advance. I hope that makes sense. Now before, I also always had a look at the production build to really show you what Next.js does under the hood, and I want to do the same here for getServer-side-props. So for this, I will add a console log statement here, where I log server-side code, so that we see when this function runs. And now if we save that file, and we again run npm run build to build this for production, we'll see when that code gets executed. Now here, if I make this a bit bigger, we see that we again pre-generated a couple of pages, and importantly, it's the same number of pages as we generated before. It's still the starting page /nothing with the revalidation recognized. It's then the 404 page, and it's then the product pages for P1, P2, P3, and so on. Now, the user profile page was not pre-generated, as is in the end signaled by this lambda symbol here. The UID file also wasn't pre-generated. So this lambda symbol here shows you that these pages are not pre-generated, but instead will be pre-rendered on the server only. And that makes sense because in user profile, we're using getServer-side-props, and in UID, we're using getServer-side-props. That's why those pages are not pre-generated. So now with that, if we again start our server with npm start here, if we load localhost 3000, we're on this page here. But if I now visit the user-profile page here, and we see Max, if we go back to that terminal where I started this production server with npm start, we see server-side code being logged here. So this output here. We see that log here, and that proves that this code now executed, but as shown before, that this page was not pre-generated. With that, I'm going to get rid of that console log statement, but I hope it's crystal clear when which code runs now. And that is it for getServer-side-props and getStaticProps, and also for getStaticPaths. I hope the differences are clear, especially between static pre-generation and server-side code that only runs there. I hope it's also clear why we use that, simply so that we can prepare data for our component ahead of time or on the server so that we can serve a finished page to the client that can offer a better user experience to our users, since they get the finished page and all the content is there right from the start, but it can also help us with search engines, since search engine crawlers also see the finished page. And with that, there's only one thing left, which I also want to take a look at in this module, and that's client-side data fetching, what that is, and when we still might need that. Now that we learned a lot about page pre-rendering and data pre-fetching in various ways, I want to conclude this course section by having another look at client-side data fetching. So basically the opposite of what we did thus far, where we talked about fetching and preparing data on the server or during the build process. When building Next.js applications, you will sometimes have data which just doesn't need to be pre-rendered or which can't be pre-rendered. Examples would be data that changes with high frequency. So for example, if you have stock data which you show on some page and that data changes multiple times every second, pre-fetching and pre-rendering might not make too much sense because you will always see outdated data when you visit this page. So in such a case, just showing a loading spinner when you visit the page and then fetching the very latest data for you and maybe updating that data in the background then might be the best user experience. Another example would be highly user-specific data. For example, the last orders in an online shop. If you are in your account, in your user profile, and you view that data, that could be an example where we don't really need to pre-render the page. Definitely not for search engines, because they won't see your private profile, and also not necessarily for the user experience, because if we go to this page, we might be more than fine with just waiting a second for the data to be loaded on the client. And having a quicker navigation to the page might be more important than having the data available right from the start. Or consider the case that you have partial data. So let's say you have like a dashboard page with lots of different pieces of data, lots of different kinds of data. In such a case, loading all these different pieces which make up the overall dashboard might just slow down the request if you do that on the server. And pre-rendering it statically during build time might also not make sense because it's personal data or because it's changing a lot. So in such a scenario, it would again probably make sense to fetch that data on the client, so from inside the regular React app once a user navigated to that page. And these are just some examples, but there can be use cases like those here where pre-fetching the data and pre-generating the page with that data might just not really work or might not make too much sense. And in such cases, it might make the most sense to use the traditional approach of writing some code in your React components, maybe with useEffect and fetch, to fetch data from some API from inside the client-side React application. So not from inside getStaticProps or getServer-side-props, but really from inside the component so that this code only runs once the code executes in the client, not on the server. And therefore that's what we're now going to take a closer look at. This here is basically an example I showed you earlier in this module already. This is a standard React app not using Next.js at all, which uses a very traditional approach of sending a request inside of useEffect once this component is rendered, setting some loading state, and then displaying some data down there. Again, that's a very standard React-ish way, and of course there are ways of changing that, of handling errors, of using custom hooks and a lot of other things, but this is the most basic form of sending a request from inside React on the client side. And in the end, that's kind of what we now want to build again with Next.js here. Now for this, I'll add a new page here, a new route therefore, and I'll name it last-sales.js. Of course, this will just be a dummy page here. This overall project is just a dummy project. We're going to have a more realistic example in the next course section when we apply this to our events project again. But in this dummy file here, in this dummy page, I want to show you how we could implement client-side data fetching with Next.js. And of course, it starts with defining our page component here. And of course, we also want to export that component so that it can be found. Now in here, in that component, we want to return some JSX code. let's say some sales data, which should be rendered as a list. But we want to fetch that data from inside this component function as well. We don't want to add get static props or get server side props here because that's exactly not our goal here. We don't want to prefetch the data on the server or during the build time. Instead here, we can now write useEffect, so use the useEffect hook, which we import from React therefore. And then in there, in this effect function, we can execute some code which sends a HTTP request. And for a useEffect, we also need to add this dependencies array, listing all the dependencies of this useEffect function. And in this case, this function won't have any dependencies since I won't use any other component-specific data here. So now in here, we can use the built-in fetch API, which is available in the browser. And as a side note, which could also be used in get static props or get server-side props, it is available there as well. We don't need it there right now, but you could use it there as well. But here we use it on the client side inside of useEffect to send a request to some API, to some web server. Now to test this, we need some dummy backend, we need some web server, and I will use Firebase for that. It sounds like it's just a database, but actually Firebase is a service offered by Google, which gives you an entire backend with a lot of different features, but one of the features is a database with an attached API, which we can use as a dummy backend here. So we're not going to build anything complex with Firebase, we're just going to use it as a dummy backend. For this, you need to go to the console, and for this you need a Google account with which you should log in. And once you did log in, you can add a new Firebase project, and I'll just name it Next.js course, but you can of course pick any name you want. Click continue. You can disable Google Analytics, we don't need that, and create that project. Again, Firebase is a service totally detached from Next.js, which is actually made up of a lot of different services and tools and utilities, which you can use to build powerful backends for your application frontends. Here, I really just want to use its built-in database with a connected API. And that will be the real-time database which I want to use. So here I'll click on real-time database on the left, and there we then can click on create database. Now you can leave the default here, click on next, and on security rules, you want to start in test mode actually, which ensures that we do have access to the database from outside. Now this will create such a database for you. The great thing is that it will be a database into which we can look into here, and we also get an API here to which we can send requests, which will then automatically be translated into database operations by Firebase. So we send regular HTTP requests to this API here, and then automatically data gets written, deleted, whatever we want to do here in Firebase. Now here I actually want to prepare some data though, so that we have some data we can fetch with our Next.js code here. Therefore, we can click on the plus here when we hover over this database name, and then add any key of your choice. I'll go with sales here, and then click on the plus here. And now we basically created a sales node, a sales table kind of, and we can now add different pieces of information that belong to a single sale. For example, here we could name this first sale, which we want to add S1, and click on the plus again and now add the data that belongs to that sale. Like for example, the username, which could be Max. Click on add now, and then click on the plus next to S1 again, and also add a volume of, let's say 100. And now let's click on the plus next to sales again, add a sale with the name of S2 and click on this plus, and here add a username of manual, and then click on the plus next to S2 and add a volume of 50. Click on add, and now we added 2 sales entries to this dummy database. Now I mentioned that it would be this URL which we can use to send a request to interact with that database. And that is correct. I'll copy that URL. And now here in fetch, we can use that URL, at least as a starter. And then here we want to send a request to the sales node and fetch all the sales. So here I'll then add /sales. And now in Firebase world, we also need to add .json at the end. This is not a Next.js requirement. This is really just required by this Firebase API we're using. And this will send a request to this sales node in this Firebase database. Again, we just use it as a dummy backend here. Now, fetch, this built-in browser API, this function which is built into the browser, then returns a promise. So here we can add a then block to work with the response, which we actually get back here. And on this response, we can call .json to read the data from that response. That's how this fetch API works. Again, nothing Next.js specific. This is the standard browser fetch API and how we can use it. So now with that, we're taking the response and extracting the response data. This again then returns a promise. So we can chain another then call here. And this will then give us the actual data which we parsed from the response. And it's now in here, in this function here, where we can use that data which we received. Now we might want to update the state of this component to output the data down there once we did get it. And for this, we can import the use state hook here and register a state in this component. Let's say the data state or the sales state with a set sales state updating function. And we call use state to initialize this state. And initially, let's say that's undefined because initially we have no sales. And maybe we also want a loading state, the isLoading state, so that we can show some loading fallback whilst we're waiting for that data to arrive. So here I'll then also set up this state, and initially it's false. And now in useEffect, in this function, we want to set isLoading to true here at the beginning, to set this loading state to true, because we are now fetching data. And once we got the data here in this second then block, we want to set sales equal to our sales data. And we'll do this in a second. And we also want to set isLoading to false here again, because we're not loading anymore. Now, regarding the sales data, it is important to know that the data we'll get back from Firebase will not be an array, but it will be an object where these IDs here, S1 and S2, will be keys, which then hold the detail data as nested objects. So if we want an array, we need to transform this data. So here we can have our transformed sales, which is an array. And we build that with a for in loop by looping through all the keys in data. Because again, data will be an object where our IDs, S1 and S2, will be keys. So then for transformed sales, we push an object into this array. And that object maybe has an ID property, which has the key as a value. Because again, the keys are these IDs. And then we have our username field, which is data for the given key, dynamically accessing it with the square brackets, which is standard JavaScript, .username. So now we're diving into that nested object here, accessing the username. And we want to do the same for the volume. So I'll also add a volume key here and set this equal to data for the given key .volume. Now I'll reformat this and it looks like this. So now this is how we transform our sales from an object to an array. And then I can set these transformed sales as my new sales. And that would be a very standard React-ish way of sending such a request. We can now use it and check if we are loading here. And if we are, I return a paragraph where I say loading, let's say, or where we show some loading spinner, of course. And otherwise here in the unordered list, we can also access our sales then, our sales state, and map our sales so that every sale is mapped into a list item where the key is set to sale.id and where we then output the sale username, then a dash maybe, and then after that the sale volume. And maybe a dollar sign in front of it, but that's just cosmetics. With all of that in place, we now got this client-side code. Now we can spin up our development server again to preview this. For this, I'll go to localhost last-sales, since that was the page name we added. And here I get an error, cannot read property map of undefined. And that makes a lot of sense because initially isLoading is false, and our sales state, which we try to use down there, is undefined. Now in useEffect we change the isLoading state, but the way React works is such that useEffect only executes the effect function after the whole component was evaluated and rendered for the first time. And for this first render cycle, sales therefore will be undefined and state will be false. So we'll reach that code and we'll then try to call map on something which is undefined. So therefore I'll add another check and check if not sales, so if we have no sales yet, in which case I return no data yet here as a paragraph. Now with that, if we save this with this extra check added, now if I reload you see loading and then you see that data eventually. And that is how we could fetch data on the client side. Now if we inspect the page source here, then the interesting thing is that we see no data yet. And that hopefully makes sense. The page is still pre-rendered by Next.js, because I explained earlier in this module that that would be the default. A page which does not use get server-side props effectively will be pre-rendered by Next.js. The key thing here just is that the data used by this page will not be prepared by Next.js with getStaticProps, for example. Hence, when Next.js pre-renders this page, it will not execute this effect, it will not wait for this, it will not care about that, it will just return and pre-render the very basic first version of what this component spits out. And that is no data yet, for the reasons I explained a couple of seconds ago. That is the initial state of this page, and that is what gets pre-rendered therefore. So we still have pre-rendering going on, but without the data, because we're fetching the data on the client side now with this approach. Now you can absolutely write this client-side data fetching code on your own as we did it here. There's nothing wrong with that. And you might have good reasons to do that, because this of course gives you full control over the entire component state and how exactly data is being fetched. But this is also such a common pattern that you could consider creating your own custom hook to outsource this logic into it, or to use a third-party hook created by someone else. And you can look into the SWR hook. If you Google for use SWR, you will find swr.versal.app. This is a React hook developed by the Next.js team, but you can use it in non-Next.js projects as well. In the end, this is a hook which under the hood still will send a HTTP request, by default using the fetch API, which we also used, but it gives you a couple of nice built-in features like caching and automatic revalidation, retries on error, and you don't have to write all that code on your own. Instead, you can use this hook in a much simpler way. The strange name, SWR, by the way, stands for stale while revalidate, which is the name of this hook because this hook has a built-in features for caching data and revalidating data to give you the most up-to-date data without you noticing in a positive way, and so on. Now you can dive into the docs of this hook to learn all about it, because you can definitely also create a short course about this hook here, but getting started with it thankfully is super simple. In our project, we just need to quit the dev server and install it as a package. With npm install swr, we install this swr hook package into our project. Now in last sales, if we want to use it, we can import it. We can import use swr from swr, just like this. This imports the hook. It's the same example you see here. And now you can use this hook in your component, so not inside of useEffect, but directly in your component. All React hooks must be used directly in a component, not in some nested function. And we use it by simply executing it. Now this hook wants at least one argument, which is an identifier for the request it should send, typically the URL of that request. And it's also called an identifier because this hook will bundle multiple requests to the same URL, which are sent in a certain time frame, into one request to avoid sending dozens of small requests. Not an issue we'll have here, but nice to have in general. So we can grab our URL here as an identifier because it will then conveniently use this identifier as a URL as well. And in the simplest form, this is all we have to do. You can add a second argument, which is a fetcher function, which is a function that describes how the request should be sent. But the default is that it will use the fetch API, so if we want to stick to that default, which I do here, we don't need to change anything. Instead, we just call used swr like this, and a request to this URL will be sent when this component is loaded. So now we can work with the data which is returned by that hook. And that will be an object, which we can destructure therefore, which contains the data that was fetched eventually and potential error information. So I'll use the exact same object destructuring here and pull out the data which we eventually get and the error which we might get. Down here in our custom code we have no error handling, but now we can easily implement it by just using this extra piece of data which we get by the use swr hook. So now with that we can comment out our custom hook. We could also delete it, but I want to keep it around for reference. We can also comment out our custom states though. And now we can work with data and error. If we don't have data yet, then we know that we're loading. So here I'll check if not data. If we don't have data yet, then I return loading. If we have an error on the other hand, I want to show an error message here like failed to load. And we should move that in front of the if data check because an error is more important than the loading state. If we have an error, I want to show it. Now, if we don't have an error and we do have data, so if we make it past these two if checks, then we can output the data. Now, the problem we'll then face, however, is that, as I mentioned, the data we get back from Firebase is not in the right format. We need to transform it. Now, to work around that issue, we got two main approaches. We could define our own fetcher function. You can learn about that here in the swr docs to basically fine-tune how exactly data will be fetched and returned. Or we again use useEffect, but now not for sending the request, but for simply transforming the data. So then here, our dependency would be the data which we get, because I want to rerun this whenever we got new data. And in useEffect, I want to check if we do have data, because if we don't have data, there's nothing we need to do. But if I do have data, then I want to go through these transformation steps here. So I'll copy this code from down there, comment this in, and then bring back my sales state here so that I can set this state after we transformed the data here in useEffect. So here, inside of this if check still, inside of useEffect, I'll then set my sales to the transformed sales, which are now based on the data key we're getting from use swr. So now we have our own transformation logic here, which will be kicked off as soon as data was fetched. And that means that now again down there, we can check that even if we have data, it might not have been transformed yet. So if we don't have sales yet, which is our transformed data, I still return a paragraph where I also say loading, for example. And of course, therefore, we can merge this and say if we don't have data or we don't have sales, I want to return loading. But if we do have both, then we can safely again output our sales. And that's how we can now use SWR and still apply our own transformation logic. With all of that, if we now save this and restart the development server, we should again have a working page. If we go back to last sales and reload, we see loading, and eventually we see the data. And still, if I view the page source, we don't see the data there, but instead we now see loading. We see loading here because that is the starting state, the first initial version of this component which is being rendered. Because initially error is undefined, so we don't return this, and data and sales are undefined, so we do return this. And therefore that's what we see as part of the pre-rendered page. And again, data fetching only happens on the client side. Now using this hook, this use SWR hook, is not mandatory. As you saw, you can write your own logic, you don't need to use it. It just can be convenient to use this hook because you save a little bit of code, especially if you also would add error handling down there. And this hook also has a bunch of other nice features which we're not using here, but which can also be very handy, like automatically refetching data when you lose and regain focus and other things like this. So that's something you can also look into, but for the moment, that's all I wanted to show here, because now we also know how we can implement client-side data fetching. Now, as a little bonus, at the end of this course section, I want to combine client-side data fetching with server-side pre-rendering. Not because we need it here, but because it can be a pattern which you do need in other kinds of applications, where you want to pre-render a basic snapshot and then still fetch the latest data from the client, and therefore that is a pattern you should also know. And I'll stick to the last sales page. Here we are already fetching data on the client. Now I just want to prepare some data on the server or during the build process as well. And therefore we can add one of the two main functions we learned about: get static props or get server-side props. And I'll go for get static props to pre-generate that during the build process and possibly revalidate it after deployment with the revalidate key. So for this we export the async function get static props here, where we get a context, which we don't need here though, so I will omit it. And then in there I want to also fetch the same data which I'm fetching here on the client side. Now for this, we now can't use the use SWR hook, because this is not a React component down there. Get static props is not a React component function, and therefore we can't use hooks in there. We'll have to write ordinary fetch code instead. So I will grab this code here from the commented out useEffect function, where we did fetch manually, and I'll copy that into get static props and comment it back in. Now get rid of the code where we set some state, we don't need that here, and we're almost good. Now we're using fetch here, and as I briefly mentioned before, you can use fetch here in get static props and get server-side props as well. Next.js ensures that this also is available in this context, so on the server side. And then we just use it as we did above. We parse the response, transform the data, and now then, once we're done transforming the data, here, after this for loop, what now? Well, now you should keep in mind that the function you have here, getStaticProps, is an async function, so it wants a promise in the end. And we do have a promise here. So all I want to do here in this second then block is return my object, which eventually should be returned by getStaticProps. I will return an object with a props key, where in there I have an object with a key of sales, which holds my transformed sales. And here we could then also add the revalidate key and set this to 10 seconds, for example, if we want to. So that, as you learned, this is executed again every 10 seconds, or at most once every 10 seconds after deployment. And now we just also need to return the overall promise chain by adding a return statement here in front of fetch, so that the overall promise with all its step and the final data here is returned by getStaticProps. Alternatively, we could of course also use the await keyword here. Then in the end, we just would have written response equals await fetch. Then here we would write const data equals await response JSON and remove this semicolon here. Remove this then block here like this. And now we would be back to the code you recognized from before. So that is how we could write this with async await. Both works, there is no better or worse alternative. It's just different syntax for the exactly same operation. So now we return our data as part of the props. And therefore now here in the last sales page, we of course should accept props again and do something with those sales we receive. The question now just is, what should we do with them? And I would say here, it makes by far the most sense to use the props we get here, the pre-fetched and pre-rendered sales, as our initial state. So the initial state for the sales state is props.sales. Those pre-rendered sales from the server or from the build process, these are the sales which are used for the initial state here. They then can and will be overwritten by the result of the client-side data fetching. But initially we use the sales which we get from getStaticProps as our state for the sales state here. And that means that now initially this here will not return loading because sales will not be undefined. However, we should change this from an OR to an AND operator. If we don't have data and we don't have sales, then I want to show loading. But now we do have sales because we pre-populate them. We initialize our state with the pre-fetched data from getStaticProps. So now we'll make it past this if check and render our initial sales here. So that's now what will be pre-rendered. And still, when this component then runs in the client, it will fetch again to fetch the latest sales. So if I save this here and I reload this page, now we see what we saw before, but if we view the page source, we see now that our sales data here is part of that pre-rendered page. And that's a difference compared to before. Now if we reload again, and the data would have changed between the point of time it was pre-rendered and prepared, and we visited this page, if the data would have changed here, then we would see the updated data here, since it is fetched in the client, but not here in the page source. Now that's hard to simulate here in development, since this will always trigger getStaticProps for every visit, but it's easier to show if I build this for production and I remove revalidate, so that this is not revalidated after running it in production, because that again will make it hard to kind of catch this page in an outdated state. So if I disable revalidate here, and I now run npm run build, so now we build a snapshot of this page once during the build process and never thereafter, then we'll see what I just said in action. So now last sales was statically pre-generated, as we can tell. And now if I run npm start to start that production server with the production ready bundle, if I reload here again, in the page source, we see our data. But if I now go to Firebase and I add a third sale here as free with a username of Julie, and give this a volume of 70, let's say. If we do that and we reload last sales again, actually we don't even need to reload because this SWR hook saw that this page got focus and it automatically refetched data. That's part of the magic this hook does. But otherwise, if we would have reloaded, it also would have fetched that data again. But in the page source of the pre-rendered page, we don't see Jolie anywhere because it was not there when we pre-rendered the page, when getStaticProps ran, but it is there once we view this in the browser, because then this code runs on the client side, this component code, and the client side data fetching kicks in. So this hopefully also is clear, and combining pre-rendering with client-side data fetching can sometimes lead to the best possible user experience because you have some data right from the start and you then update it from inside the browser. Now this was a long module with a lot of key concepts. In general, this module was about how Next.js pre-renders pages for us, so that if we view the page source, we have some data in that page source, some data which is there right from the start and which is therefore also visible to search engine crawlers, which is a key difference to standard React apps without server-side rendering. Now you did learn that out of the box, Next.js pre-renders your pages. It does that automatically. But you can also force it to do so by adding getStaticProps, because you add this function whenever you also want to prefetch data for your component. So if your page component doesn't need any data, of course you never add getStaticProps typically, because it doesn't add anything to the page then. But if your page does need data, like the list of products here, then you add getStaticProps so that during the build process, this data is prefetched and available for the page when it's pre-rendered, so that the pre-rendered page contains prefetched data. Now, since getStaticProps executes during the build process, you can execute Node.js code in there, which wouldn't run in the browser. For example, you can get access to the file system and read data from files. Now, since data can get outdated after the pages were pre-generated, you can also add the revalidate key here in the object you return from inside getStaticProps to tell Next.js that this page should be regenerated again and again even after the page was built and deployed, at most every X seconds, here at most once every 10 seconds. Therefore, getStaticProps is great for ensuring that you are pre-rendering pages with data. Now, if you have dynamic pages with a dynamic parameter, then you also need to let Next.js know how many instances of that page should be pre-rendered, because it could be an infinite amount in theory. You do that with getStaticPaths, and you need to add this when using getStaticProps on such a dynamic page. Otherwise, you'll get an error because Next.js doesn't know how many pages to prepare. GetStaticPaths returns an object with a paths key, which holds an array of parem objects in the end, where you basically just make Next.js aware of all the parameter values for this dynamic page that should be used for pre-rendering a page. And you can also reach out to a file system or database or whatever you need to do here. And when you do that, Next.js will pre-generate all the paths, so all the instances of that page for the paths you tell it to pre-render. It will then call getStaticProps for every page instance that it creates. You can access the params there, as you learned, and then you can fetch and prepare the data there just as it's needed, return that to the component function, and then last but not least, Next.js will execute this component function in the build process or on the server to pre-render this page as well with the appropriate data. Now, sometimes you don't want to pre-build during the build process, and even when using revalidate, the data might not be updated enough. Instead, you really might want to run logic for every incoming request, either because you need access to the request or because the data changes all the time. In such cases, you can use get server-side props. It's an alternative, and unlike get static props, this really runs on the server and only on the server, not during the build process. Here, you can get access to the request and response objects, to the real node request and response objects, and you still return props to the component, which is then pre-rendered, but pre-rendered on the fly on the server. You can also do that for dynamic pages, and here you don't need get static paths because this now really does only execute when it's needed, not in advance. However, sometimes that's also not what you're looking for. Sometimes you really need to fetch data from inside the client, or you want to combine pre-rendering with client-side data fetching. And that's what we saw in the last lectures. You can also still write regular React code, regular React JavaScript code for fetching data in your component function. And this code will then not be executed on the server, even though the page will still be pre-rendered, but this code will be skipped, since it's inside of useEffect typically. Instead, you'll just get some snapshot of your page, which is then returned, and that code really only runs in the client, so when a visitor visits the page. Here, you can also consider using the use SWR hook, since that can make writing that code a bit easier, and since that is a feature-rich custom hook built by the Next.js team, which, for example, also automatically refetches data if you lose and regain focus in your browser tab. So that can also be nice. And as you saw, you can even still combine that with preparing and prefetching data. And therefore, this was a long module, but data fetching and pre-rendering of pages with prefetched data is another key aspect of Next.js. The file-based routing was nice and already a great feature, but this here, prefetching and pre-rendering, that's the feature which really makes Next.js super powerful. Because now it's easy to optimize pages for search engines, it's easy to show users some data right from the start, and you can still apply everything you know about React. And therefore, let's now apply what we learned here to our demo project in the next section before we then dig deeper into Next again.